All right, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Showverse. Today, I have with us a special guest in the form of writer, director, producer, composer, editor, basically a jack of all trades. I have with us today Jonathan Oster, who currently has his new movie out, Jane's Not Here, which tells the story of a woman who wakes up from a 3-month coma and realizes that the life that she thought she had was nothing more than a dream and has to learn how to cope with these new feelings of loss and I guess an unfound feeling of unsteadiness. It's a very deeply complex movie. But Jonathan, thank you for coming with us on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me, Noah. I really appreciate it.
Oh, not a problem at all. As someone who has had the privilege of watching your movie just a little early, I gotta say, I can't say I love it because this is a very, it's one of those movies where you have to appreciate it due to its very complex and deep story. This is a layered movie that is very hard to digest at times because it deals with a very, very hard subject, which is essentially, not knowing who you are and regret for a life that you thought you could live, or rather what you thought you did live. It's deeply saddening in ways that I was not really prepared for, but kind of like a really good drama, I embraced the hurt and I loved every second of it because of just how well executed of an idea that you had.
I really appreciate it, and it's yeah, I mean parts of it are certainly kind of deeply sad and depressing, but I think there's also a lot of humor there and there's, a bit of romance and there's some, kind of lovely relationships between our main character Jane and her brother Brady as well as her nephew Dylan. There's a lot of things like that as well. It's also, as you say, it's complicated. It is a complicated movie, and personally speaking, I've always loved kind of movies where you almost have to go back and rewatch it a couple times. Or you don't have to, but it's, you'll appreciate it more when you do because, I've always loved movies where there's kind of some grand mystery and you're left with the puzzle pieces to kind of assemble everything together alongside the main character. And that's certainly what Jane's Not Here is. At its core, it's certainly kind of an intimate drama, a character study, but wrapped around that is, kind of a thriller, and wrapped around that is a mystery. I mean, it's really a mystery where you have to figure out what's going on along with the lead character.
And that's actually something I do want to give praise to because when she first wakes up, it is shot and your direction is presented in a way where you're not entirely sure if like what's happening is real. You're not sure if she is Jane, if she is Anna. It's this very deep uncertainty that unfolds throughout the movie where you learn more about who Jane really is rather than what she was. And
Mhm, mhm.
I do admire a character study like this because a lot of us do ask this question, which is what would happen if we were put in this situation? And I believe this does answer it pretty well. So, my first real question is where exactly did you come up with this idea?
Yeah, just really quick, going back to what you just said for just one moment, which is, everyone has kind of asked themselves that question of, what would they do? I think that's absolutely true, and I think that that's one of the things that drew me so much to this premise is it's completely universal. It's completely universal that we've all asked that question, and so hopefully, I think it's going to kind of appeal to a lot of people. But in terms of the premise, my sister came to me with the premise. She's always, she's loved movies. We've loved movies together. We've loved watching movies. And, like I said kind of earlier, specifically kind of mystery puzzle piece movies. We've always loved the kind of movie where you have to watch it and assemble those puzzle pieces and figure things out alongside the main character. And we've always loved movies where you really think about it after the credits roll, where it's not just something you're thinking about while you're watching it, but it's something you actually take away, after the credits roll, after you've stepped out of the theater, after you're done streaming it, whatever it is. Just movies that make you ask questions and ponder things and make you potentially want to watch it again to see all the things, the little things that were possibly in plain sight that you missed. So yeah, my sister, who has always been, incredibly artistic and has always loved watching movies alongside me. She gave me this terrific premise, and I wrote the script around it.
Man, that really your sister helped you basically give you the conception of this idea.
Yeah, that's correct. And she especially at the time, she was just much busier than me, so it's something that she couldn't necessarily execute upon, she has a kid and a full-time job, and I have all of that now as well. But at the time when I was making the movie, I didn't necessarily, my wife was pregnant, but I didn't have a child yet, so I had more time to do things, and that's always kind of been the case, and it'll be fun, hopefully it'll be like that kind of going forward, where I think she just has these really really good ideas, and she gives them to me, and I just have a lot of fun, bringing it to the screen and actually writing it out and bringing it out to the screen.
And if I may ask, is your sister also a filmmaker like you, or is she just someone that you kind of shoot the shit with to essentially be like, hey, would you want to watch this? I think that'd be pretty cool. Okay, cool. Thank you. I'm gonna try making that now.
100%. Yeah, shoot the shit. We shoot the shit all the time, and she does work that, it's not particularly creative work, but she's always been very good with creative things, in hobbies. She's always been very good at painting. She's always been very good at drawing. And again, growing up and still to this day, because we're very close, kind of the number one thing we do together is watch movies. We'll have a movie night, once a week. And that's just been going on for years and years and years, since we were kids, because we love movies. And I don't want to speak for her too much, but I can certainly tell you that, movies are my favorite art form. Just it's the perfect bringing together of performance and story and visuals and music and everything like that. So yeah.
It's funny you bring that up because
Mhm.
movies are a big part of my family as well.
Mhm.
And one of the first shorts I ever made, I made with my sister, and it
Yeah.
oh no, it's really really it was really great. Unfortunately, two big things happened. In the story, it revolves around the main character's sister dying. So of course, I played the main character. So it's like, first one to make, sister dies. But there's this dream sequence we shot, and
Yeah.
she slaps me across the face. So it's
Did
nice.
you say it's a train sequence?
Oh no, dream
Oh,
sequence.
a dream
Don't
sequence.
don't worry.
I
We
see.
we will get to that further
Okay.
into the interview. But
Uh-huh.
no,
Yeah.
overall, one of the deeper themes that clearly resonates with me and is a big part of you is the whole familial aspect of Jane's not here. You have the brother played brilliantly by Steve Mahlers is his name, Steve Mahlers?
That's right. Yep. Yep.
Yeah, who works really, really well off of Amelia Barr, who plays Jane slash Anna. And so, what I'm wondering is, how did you get them to that stage where they had this amazing chemistry? Did you do rehearsals? Did you give them intricate backstories? Or was it just, here's the script, I trust you guys, go?
It's funny because that's actually one of the things I'm most proud of the film is the casting. It's a really kind of independent feature, and we made it for a very small budget and with very few crew members. On any given day, I think we had maybe 4 to 5 people, but that meant everyone was wearing a lot of hats, and that includes me, and so I cast the movie as well. And so, I I initially met with Steve and I initially met with Amelia kind of separately. And I mean, they were both just so charismatic and they were both so funny and smart and, you know, intelligent. And Amelia in particular was incredibly bubbly, you know, and just they both were kind of exactly as the characters were, you know. I mean, so in that sense, you know, as a director, I really didn't feel like I had to do much. You know, I mean, they were just so good. They were naturals. But I'm more proud of myself from that aspect as a casting director than I am as a director because, you know, I found them ultimately. But from a director's standpoint, they were just so good that I really didn't have to do much or give them, you know, terribly many notes. And yeah, you know, in terms of rehearsals, you know, I think we probably had 3 rehearsal days before shooting that both Amelia and Steve were directly connected with. But you know, I mean, they just did such a great job, and you really buy into the fact. I hope that they are siblings, that they are brother and sister. I mean, they're so alike in so many ways, and you know, they look quite similar as well. Um, but yeah, you know, and in real life as well, they're both just absolutely amazing people. And I think you can tell that they are really through their performances on the screen.
I would also just like to say you think and you hope. I mean, for goodness sakes, for any of you that have watched the movie, whether it be now or way down the line, know that their chemistry works really, really well, and you totally buy their relationship in the movie. There's bickering, but there's also love behind the bickering, which I think goes for any sort of sibling relationship. That yeah, see, see,
Yes,
I know
I'll
that
say.
look, but this actually goes, you kind of already answered one of my other questions, which was so right before Jane wakes up, she has this whole other life. And so essentially something I was wondering is did you actually like write some or did you have an idea of kind of like the life she lived so you can give that level of direction to Amelia so that way when she wakes up, she has to kind of juggle those inner memories while she's trying to readjust back to her old life.
You know, I think it was lucky in the sense that Amelia, you know, the characters that Amelia plays, you know, Anna and Jane, you know, they're really quite similar. They're quite similar in a lot of ways. So they're both, you know, as I described before, they're intelligent and smart and bubbly and incredibly friendly and so from that standpoint. I don't think it was overly difficult for Amelia to kind of, you know, switch kind of mindset and go from, you know, this to Jane and back. But you know that's also kind of it's more of a question for her, I suppose. Um, yeah, does that make sense?
No, that makes perfect sense because in my mind, you know, sometimes when I prep stuff, I like to give like as much detail as possible. But for something like this, as you put it earlier, it's best to put your faith in your actors to know what it is that the story requires of them. And I do also want to draw praise to Amelia. Oh God, I just said her last name. What was her last name again? Amelia Barr. Amelia Barr.
Amelia Barr. Yes, yes,
Oh,
yes.
my Lord. I would like to draw praise to her because this is not an easy role to fill. It
No, no,
requires
no.
a lot emotionally and to even some extent a little bit physically. It is
Yes.
exhausting on both accounts. So I would like to draw praise to her while I have a little bit of time.
And to give her even a little bit more praise, and you know, again, so many of the things, for instance, you know, when she wakes up in the hospital, you know, it was just really her experimenting with that, you know, and she kind of really went out of her way to research things and you know I mean we all did but she in particular went out of her way to really research things and figure out how people would talk, how people would move after coming out of a coma, you know, all of that stuff and she really found her own voice because yeah, I mean in a way she is kind of playing almost, you know, 3 characters or just 3 different people in the film, right? You have, you know, the one, you know, Anna, then you have Jane, but then when Jane wakes up from the coma, I mean her mannerisms and her speech and exactly as you say, her way of moving is very different from the other from the other versions, right? And she did so much research there. So yeah, yeah, as you say, it's huge props to Amelia. I mean, she was outstanding.
And especially the scene where she wakes up, because I have been with people who have woken up from not from comas, but from surgery where they're put under. And
Mhm.
it's not like a regular sort of drugged up that, any normal person is used to, whether it be, weed or something else the other kind. This is something
Mhm.
a little more intense and a little more
Yeah.
it alters a mind in a way that is not what we're used to. And she portrayed
Yeah.
it so convincingly. And I do wonder, did you give her any sort of direction, or was it just really a matter of you had faith in your actress and you let her do what she needed to do?
I'm trying to look back, I think at the end of the day, we had practiced this a little bit beforehand as well. And, well, obviously we practiced it a little bit beforehand as well. And, she gave me a few different versions and, I think some were maybe a little bit louder, then I think some were a little bit more subdued. And I think we found a really nice kind of in between, you know. I think we found a really nice in between. So, but overall, I didn't have to give her too much direction from that standpoint because she just did so much of the research. And yeah, I mean, just incredible. I can't heap enough praise on Amelia because, from the second I met her, I just knew that she was the right actress to do it, and she just did such a phenomenal job. I mean, it's crazy.
No, absolutely. And here's my ham-fisted segue. Uh, what else is really crazy is that the fact that, and you brought this up earlier, you did this whole movie for a rather small budget. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I did a little bit of research before this interview, and according to, Google, IMDb, and other sources, your budget was just shy of $60,000. Would that be correct?
More or less there. Yeah.
So, as we have now seen with well, not other movies, with one movie in particular, Obsession, which has gotten quite the accolades left and right, but its
Mhm.
main point of conversation is the fact that it was done for such a very small budget, at least for a feature film released in theaters like, From Focus Features and Blumhouse, yada yada yada. But what I'm always particularly impressed by is what a production can do with the money that's given to them. So you talked about you wearing a lot of hats. And to those of you watching, the joke I made earlier, where I introduced him as writer, director, producer, and then composer and an editor, that's not like me. That was not me trying to be fully funny. Jonathan, you actually were one of the composers for this movie, one of the editors for this movie. And
Yeah.
you know, I would like to know how you managed to stretch that budget into the way that you did, because this movie looks like it could easily have been done by anybody. So, can you elaborate on that process?
Yeah, well, I think it's almost going to kind of sound cliche at this point, but I think if you have a story you want to tell, well, you just have to keep pushing and tell it no matter what, no matter what limitations you have, no matter what obstacles, you just have to push through and do it. And so, I'm trying to think of particular. I think it really helped that, in some ways it made things more difficult. So we had a very small crew due to the limitations with the budget. Working with a very tight budget meant that we had a very small crew. And, in some regards, that was made things more difficult, right? Because, it took a lot more time to set things up and all of this, right? But it also meant that we had to spend a lot less money, right? If you have four people or five people, including myself, on any given day, instead of 20 or 30 crew members, well, the cost of the production goes significantly down. And for me personally, as we said, I did the directing, I did the writing, the co-editing, and I did the music for the movie and the casting for the movie. You know, all of that, doing all of that myself meant that it was just much cheaper because I didn't have to pay other people to do it. But I won't lie, it was also extremely fun for me to do that. I think there's an argument to be made that even if I had a significantly larger budget for the film, it would go to kind of other departments than those, because I had so much fun doing it. But I think just having that very small crew and many people taking many different responsibilities, I think it really meant that we were able to work with that uber tight budget. I really think that's what it is.
No, and that's what it should
And
be.
and and, and there's oh, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just remembered something, but it's also we also we purposefully we used less equipment, for instance, right? So, as another example, renting and purchasing a lot of equipment costs a lot of money, right? Well, instead of doing that, we had a one camera setup and, we had a one camera setup and we used very minimal lighting, right? We took advantage of natural lighting. What additional lighting we brought was again minimal and we just used it to enhance the natural lighting that was already there. Little decisions like that throughout the production that I think really worked well for the aesthetic of the film and kind of the realistic kind of the gritty realism we were kind of going for, but also really helped to keep the budget down.
And I'm guessing it also helped that you had Bella Demasquita, who was your DP.
Demasquita, yeah, that's a hard one, yeah, yeah, but
Oh,
very good, Bella Demasquita.
and she right,
Hmm.
she was also your DP on your previous movie Departure. Was that
Yeah,
correct? So I'm
yeah,
guessing that.
yeah, yeah.
Oh, sorry. Uh,
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, Bella was just absolutely amazing. And Bella's actually one of my oldest friends, going back to the seventh grade or something like that. So a long time, maybe years or something like that. And Bella's just an amazing talent, and we would she's just responsible for the entire kind of look of the feel, and we almost wanted it to look like not necessarily like documentary, but like the camera was just kind of a fly on the wall, nothing, always just kind of observing, like you're trying to witness a natural conversation between people. So, there's a perfect example of that towards the beginning of the film when we're on a train and the camera is just kind of, it's in one of the chairs and it's focused on a conversation happening across. And it just looks like the camera, or it feels like the camera is another passenger on the train observing that conversation. Bella just did a tremendous job.
And by the way, great choice to keep the fly on the wall direction as well as the cinematography aspect because it does deal levels of immersion that I think really does work best for the story. But
Yes.
like I said, like I was getting at before, one thing that I think works well when you're working on a budget of this scale is having people that you can rely on to execute your vision in a streamlined and also professional manner.
Mhm.
Now, I mentioned before that you worked with Bella on your short film Departure. I would also like to know how does Departure compare to something like this? What were the things that you noticed in terms of similarities and differences?
Well, I think it's funny because Departure was also kind of a skeleton crew, but it was much more so. I believe on Departure it was really just Bella and myself. And it was even kind of it was just much smaller. It was much more intimate, and I think for Departure, I think really we had one primary filming location, maybe two. I think there's a funeral home and then there's a house, and that's largely it. So it was really small, and I think that's the nature of a lot of shorts is that it tends to be really small. And when you compare that with a feature, I mean, it's similar in the sense that the story should be the most important part, and the script should be the most important part for a short or a feature. That's something that certainly never changes, or it shouldn't. But a feature is just an entirely different beast. I mean, it's so much bigger and it can be so much more overwhelming. And, for a story kind of this scope, it was just so many more locations and it was so much more time and it was so much more reaching out to people to see if they will help. Specifically, we just talked about locations, or I just mentioned it, reaching out, kind of cold reaching out to locations to see if we could use their houses or hospital or this or that. So it was really different in that sense too. Just that the departure really took place in a house largely that you could just get that from family. In fact, that's what we did. But for this, there were just so many things that we couldn't rely on that for. There were, in addition to houses, there was grocery stores, there was a train station, there was a train, there was, multiple hospital rooms and just so much more. So I think, truly the answer is just that features are just much bigger and it's just a lot more work, but it is similar in the sense that it all depends on that story and the story needs to be there before you can really continue.
And what's really rather interesting is you brought up locations, and then Jane's Not Here does have quite a few locations. And I I want to bring back this is a multi-layered question. So first, I'd like to know how did you, let's just let's rip the Band-Aid off. There is a scene with there's two scenes revolving around trains. There's one on the
Mhm.
train, and then there's one, let's just say, outside of a train. Um,
Mhm.
how did you get access to those two locations?
Well, ultimately, the Osceola train depot, Osceola and St. Croix train depot, um, they were wonderful enough to let us kind of use their train. They basically have a route. It's in Wisconsin and it goes into Minnesota, and they have an old steam train that, from the outside, it looks like a passenger train minus the steam, right? And which looks a little older. And obviously in the script, we needed a modern passenger train. So we were just careful about the way we filmed it. But essentially they don't run every day for, actual customers who want to take tours on it. So we rented them out for, a day when they weren't doing tours. And it was really just incredible. They were so accommodating. We probably had 50 background actors, extras on that day, which again is something I'm just enormously proud of considering how small the crew was, and I'm very proud of that we kind of achieved that. So yeah, and it's funny because originally, actually, when after I wrote the script and I was thinking, how are we going to do this? Um, one of the options I was looking at was a little bit of movie magic, and I considered using a party bus, hiring and renting out a party bus because specifically for the inside, a party bus can kind of be made to look a little bit like a train, right? I mean, you have the windows, you have the seats, and the seats very often are similar. So I had reached out to a party bus company. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name right now. And I kind of told them a little bit about the film and what we were hoping to do. And then they actually put us in touch and said maybe it would be a better idea to reach out to the Osceola, train depot. And that's what we did. And again, they were just wonderful enough to actually accommodate it.
Which, for a project like this that requires certain levels of trains to be a part of the story, that's honestly wonderful, including the extras, which we'll get back to that in a little bit. But one thing you also mentioned is the hospital, and
Yeah.
a good bit of this movie does take place in a hospital. Now, we do have an exterior shot of a hospital, but we also have a couple interior shots that revolve. We have Jane's hospital room, and we on top of that have the physical therapy area. Now, I'm wondering, how did you get access to those areas? Were they all under the same hospital, or did you go to different locations because you wanted different feels for those scenes?
Yeah, well, the hospital was kind of another, I mean, it was another kind of headache to get because like I said, it was a lot of cold calling places. And, we reached out to just tons of hospitals in the Minneapolis, St. Paul, and beyond area, hours outside of the Twin Cities as well. In Minnesota, to see if they would kind of accommodate filming on their premises. And, we kind of got just rejection after rejection after rejection, which, I can't be too angry about because, there's all sorts of insurance reasons and whatnot, and it can be a headache for them as well, right? So ultimately, what we did is, again, thinking outside the box a little bit, is we started reaching out to schools around the Minneapolis area because very often, nursing schools or schools that do kind of medical training, they'll have what you call simulation centers, and that's centers in their schools that are designed to really replicate and look like and feel like and act like a lot of the interiors of hospitals. So that's what we did, in particular, we used for all of the hospital scenes, we used St. Catherine's University. Um, they were just gracious enough to allow us to film there in their simulation rooms, and it looks exactly like a hospital. I think it's completely convincing, and we used, because there's a hospital setting that comes up towards, the beginning of the film, and then there's a hospital setting that comes, towards the end of the film, as you kind of, mentioned. And we use St. Catherine's for both of them. I mean, they have a very large simulation center, and we just used different areas of it to kind of give it another feel.
And yeah, you fooled me because I thought you shot at a like an actual like you just called in saying, "Hey, can we like borrow your hospital like one of your hospital rooms for like maybe 4 hours,
Yeah,
maybe 5 hours?"
yeah. It is very, very convincing, I do think.
And hey, it worked on a schmo like me, so I think that
There
speaks
we
to the
go.
level of attention to detail and craft as well as authenticity that comes with, trying to replicate a hospital room.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But, trying to secure a location is one thing. That's already a difficult aspect enough. But what is a world that you're trying to present without people? And there are a couple sequences, such as the one with the train, as well as a couple parties that take place that will have, I don't want to say an extensive amount of extras, but they do have, they definitely have more than like 15 people on screen at one singular time. So,
Mhm,
what I'm
mhm.
wondering is, how did you actually make that happen? How did you execute it?
Well, firstly, in particular for the train sequences, we had actually reached out to someone who makes, movies around the Twin Cities area called Bill Cooper, and he was incredibly helpful, So essentially, and I like to tell him that I'm sure he doesn't even realize it, but he was really responsible for just achieving so many of the extras and background actors for those train sequences, because he has a nice social media following. He's connected to a lot of the actors and film people around town. And yeah, he put out a couple posts about it. And it's amazing what just putting out a couple posts on Facebook or social media can really do because we got 50 background actors out of it, and they were all just so incredible and nice, and it was really fun to direct them. So that's how that happened. And with the party scenes, yeah, there's kind of two party scenes, and you know, both of them were it was kind of a mixture. We went through a couple acting and model agencies in the Twin Cities area, and some of the actors were represented by those modeling agencies, those acting agencies, and we hired them, and again they did a terrific job. And then, again, some of the background actors were just in Minnesota. You have some really nice Facebook, film group pages, where, people who love indie film and want to be a part of it, they're very active on there. And, we just put out a couple of posts saying that we needed some background actors for these party scenes. And I mean, people were just remarkably helpful. I mean, I think throughout really the process of making Jane's Not Here, I was just consistently surprised by how nice people really were, and how nice and kind people were to indie filmmaking, and how many people really wanted to be involved with it. You know.
No, it's always good to get help from people that truly believe in not only the vision, but the passion of the art form itself. And it, like I said before, a world is only as believable as the people that you populate the story with. So thankfully, the world felt rich as it did feel alive. However, moving just a little bit away from that, and but still on the same level of actors, you do actually do. Sorry, tongue twister. You do have a couple characters played by kids, and I will not name them just for obvious sakes, but I do want to ask a couple questions in regards to that because usually when it comes to child actors, you sometimes either run the risk of they're just not properly trained or you run into what's it called, child labor laws, which means you only get like a certain amount of time with them on set every day, or they're a little too professional and it kind of ruins the whole, oh, these are supposed to be kids because now they're operating on the same level as adults are. So from your perspective, did you have any issues working with any of these kid actors? Or was it just, I don't want to say smooth sailing because no performance is ever really a smooth sailing. There's always work that has to be made. But tell me your experience with that, and at least in your eyes.
Well, I certainly think, I mean, children just aren't as, they're not kind of as advanced, obviously, as adults, right? And they're still, growing and they're still learning. So I think, there was certainly instances where, we'd have to do several takes and things like that. But I mean, overall, I think that I don't want to say we were lucky because again, we auditioned multiple kind of kids for each of the roles before ultimately selecting, the actors who would be playing Tommy and Dylan, right? Um, Ultimately, I think they just did a wonderful job. They were just very good. They were kind of naturals. I think both of them had worked, had done a bit of commercial work or things like that before. Um, but it's as you say, you also don't want them to be kind of too theatrical. You don't want them to be kind of too planned or too performative, right? You want them to feel very real. And I think that's kind of exactly what they brought to it. Just as I kind of tried to make when I was writing the script, I tried to make the conversations, between the kids and the adults or the kids and the kids or whatever. I tried to make those feel as real as possible. I wanted the performances to feel as real as possible. And I think just there was something about both of them that was not overly performative and did not feel like acting that I think you can very often kind of run into that problem. It felt very natural. It didn't feel like they were reading words off a page. It felt like that's what they would say, and it felt like that's how they would say it. And it's just kind of, how I imagined it when I was writing it. And that's always a blessing for a director.
It's once again, it goes back to casting, getting lucky, finding people that fit the role, and being able to work with alongside said role. And that's pretty much all I'll say about that. But I do kind of want to turn the ship a little back towards the I guess filmmaking process of it all. We talked a little about how you stretched a budget, how you were able to secure locations, as well as getting extras. But actually, I want to know about your experience, at least in the grand scope of things. Now, this is going to be more like rapid fire sort of, I'm going to throw a lot of questions at you, but feel free to answer them at your own leisure or to the extent that you feel comfortable with. Out of the three, main forms of filmmaking, which is the development stage slash pre-production, the filming stage, and then the post-production stage, which stage of this entire process did you find either the most rewarding or the most fun?
Are you sure that I could give kind of longish answers or answers that aren't terribly short?
Hey, answer them in a way that you best see fit.
Okay, okay. Um, I think ultimately what was most rewarding was kind of the production, just because that's when, again, especially when you have such a small crew, it's really intimate and you're able to kind of befriend people in a way that I don't think you can with 30 crew members, for instance. So everyone became very close. All of the actors, all of the crew members, and myself, I think we really became good friends, and I think we will be for a very, very long time. And so, that's absolutely kind of the most important, and I think, and the most rewarding, the most fun. That was really fun as well. But for me in particular, there's something about editing a movie that I just find so fun. I find it so fun that an editor over here can take footage that's been shot and put together a completely different movie than an editor over here. I think that's so fun, and that's where a lot of the magic happens. So, I loved the post-production. That was very fun.
So the most rewarding was actually the filming stage of it all, where you got to meet everybody and you are clearly like forming your bond and your crew. The most fun that you actually had was in post-production, which I can't blame you or argue with you on that because you're literally building the film. But I will
Yes.
say this, I hate editing so much. Um, because it is a very tedious process. But, once you finally get the whole thing finished, it's that sense of accomplishment definitely hits you in waves. Now, next one. What was the most challenging aspect that you found throughout this entire ordeal? Whether it be a certain sequence in the film or a stage of production, what was the most challenging thing you experienced?
I think pre-production was the most difficult. I think going from, writing a script and getting that ball rolling, going from writing a script to, taking words off of a page and trying to turn that into a reality, that's very daunting and that can be very overwhelming, if you let it be. And very challenging. And like I said, we ran into, in particular with securing locations, we ran into so many situations where we were just kind of like, how are we going to do this? How are we going to achieve this with the budget we have? How are we going to get a hospital? How are we going to get a train? And so it was just so much, cold calling people and reaching out to people and getting rejection after rejection and stepping out of your comfort zone to do these things as well. I was certainly stepping out of my comfort zone a lot. Ultimately, it worked out really, really well, I think. And there were so many people who were willing to accommodate, but that was really challenging. That was the most challenging for me. And again, that comes in the form of pre-production. It was very challenging.
It's also the most important stage of any film, regardless. If you go into a movie with the best planned out process that you have, everything else should, then again, in this business, should, would, and could are death sentences, but should go smoothly or as smoothly as a ship in a tsunami can go. Now, going to the actual shooting process, what was your favorite scene to shoot? Without spoilers, obviously.
Yes, yes. There's a scene that's well, it's not quite halfway through the movie, but there's a scene in the movie where it's between Amelia, so Jane played by Amelia Barr, and Brady played by Steve Mollers, where they're in a hospital room and they're just kind of sitting, and Steve comes into the room and he's essentially doing everything he can to help Jane remember. I just said Steve and then Jane. Brady, Brady, the character Brady, is
Yes.
doing everything he can to help Jane remember who she is, who she was before waking up from the coma. And he brings in a photo book and he shows her pictures and all of this and he brings up things from their past. And I think that was my favorite part to film. I think it might be my favorite sequence in the film as well, but I think it was my favorite thing to shoot just because that is the core of the movie. That's the core of the movie, really, is the relationship between the siblings. Obviously the film is, it's about kind of a mom trying to find her son, right? That's at the very core of it. But you know, Amelia and Steve are present throughout the film, and it's their relationship that keeps things going. It is the very heart of the movie. So I think that was the best scene for me to film. I think that was the best.
And were there any changes that you had to make from the shooting draft of the script to, I guess, by the time the filming had wrapped? Were there any changes that were made from script to when you entered post? And if so, what were they? Were they large or were they just very small things?
Without going into too much detail, because, those are more so lessons for me going forward with other projects. There were certain things, there were certain things where ultimately, as an example, I think we filmed two additional scenes. Um, and I think that I just deemed them not to be necessary, or we deemed them not to be necessary. They didn't really push things forward, and they perhaps developed the characters a little bit more in some sense, but not enough to warrant their runtime, and it just wasn't entirely necessary. So little things like that, but that was rare.
Oh, so you actually wound up having to cut things out of the movie.
A couple small things, yes.
Ah, I know that feeling. It's what was it? Denis Villeneuve said something like "killing your darlings" or whatnot. But hey, it's whatever serves the movie best.
Yes, and Kill Your Darlings is something that we would always be talking about, and Lucas Mooney, my assistant director and my co-editor, he would use that phrase quite frequently, actually. So that's funny you bring that up.
Oh man, and it's never an easy thing. But I guess my final one of these rapid fire questions for you, and I know this might be a little touchy, so you don't need to answer if you don't want to. Is there anything in particular that now that you've seen like the full movie, you've been like, okay, this is done. Is there anything that you would want to change or go back and redo? Anything at all? Or are you just like, you want to know what? I'm happy with this. I don't think I need to change anything at all.
Well, ultimately, we just had our world premiere at Dances with Films in LA, and I mean it was such an amazing experience. It was so much fun, and it's just such a great festival, and anytime you get accepted into a festival like that, it's kind of you have difficulty saying you would change a lot because what you did got you to that place, which is so great, right? What I can say is, yeah, I think most filmmakers would look back on their work and say, "Oh, I wish I had done this differently." And I can certainly say there are things like that in the film, that I would say. But at the same time, I don't linger too much on questions like that, only in the sense that I think it's more helpful for me to really you know, to really apply that for things going forward, to take the lessons that I learned from Jane's Not Here, which again I'm very happy with how it turned out. But to take those lessons and instead of looking back on Jane's Not Here with, what things would I do differently, simply take those lessons and apply it to future things. So for instance, there's absolutely some things that some other scripts that I had written that I plan to work on one day and hopefully bring to the screen that after making Jane's Not Here and having that experience, I went on to those and I was like, well, okay, does this have to be this way? Maybe I could change this a bit. Maybe this could go here. Maybe this could go there. Little things like that. But yeah, I think probably most filmmakers would be lying if they said that they wouldn't do certain things differently.
What I at least appreciate about your answer is the fact that you acknowledge that there are probably things that you'd want to do differently, but it's the product that you made that got you to this point. So why focus on what you should change, but more take what you want and apply it towards the future? I think that's actually a very mature answer.
Thank you. I 100%, I think that's true. I think it's true.
And I I will I will say this as well, because earlier, before we started shooting this, I was actually going to bring up, what other things you have down the pipeline. But before we get into any of that, which we will soon, don't worry, I actually do want to know because this did premiere at DWF. And I for those that aren't able to attend DWF, is there another way that someone could possibly watch this movie, at least in the next couple of months or so?
Well, that's always the hope going forward, I think, for any filmmaker is that their movie kind of finds distribution. Right now, though, we're not really focused on that, and we're just continuing with the festival route. So it had its world premiere here. We have been applying, or rather submitting to festivals kind of, across the United States, in our home state of Minnesota, but beyond that, across the, United States as well as overseas. And, we're just not going to hear back for a little bit, but it's absolutely our hope that, wherever you may be watching, it could be playing in a festival there. Um, but it might take some time. It might take some time before we hear back on that. But ultimately, the goal is absolutely that you'll be able to, if not see it in a theater, see it on streaming on one of the platforms.
And
But
for those
again, I'll keep you updated on that. Absolutely, Noah.
Much appreciated, Jonathan. And for those of you watching, details at least about Jane's Not Here will be in the description below. And hopefully, by the time the film is ready for a wider release, that will be in the description below as well. Now, we are coming up towards the end of our nice little discussion here. I would like to know because you did mention you do have scripts that you'd like to shoot. So, is there anything in the pipeline that we should probably keep our eyes out for? Or, is that a little too far away to start bringing up this early?
Yeah, I always have things kind of that on the horizon that I want to make. In particular, there's a feature script that I would like to make that, I kind of like to describe as a mix of, Good Will Hunting and Mystic River. I think it's really something special. It's really good, but that's a little bit far away right now, and I'm so focused on Jane's Not Here, and kind of it's road through the festivals, but I will tell you that I'm working on something right now. I'm actually shooting something right now, and that's a short film. And it kind of feels good as well to go from a feature back to a short film. It's a little bit less intense, and it's called Deeper. And Deeper, it follows kind of a man dealing with some deep psychological issues who turns to a AI chatbot for psychiatric help. And again, I'm currently making that. So before my trip out to LA, which is where I am now for the Dances with Film Festival, I shot about half of it, and I'm shooting the other half when I return home. But it's very different from Jane's Not Here. While Jane's Not Here is more methodical and more of a slow burn, and it really takes its time. I think Deeper is very fast paced. It's very energetic, and it's very kind of explosive. And it's also a dark comedy. It's very different. I wanted to try something different. And again, it really touches on something that's quite relevant and quite topical right now. That's kind of happening more and more.
Geez, well, I would like to say I'm deeply interested in seeing what may come of this. Otherwise, without anything left to say, Jonathan, thank you so much for stopping by and telling us about Jane's Not Here. I hope your film does well in the festival circuit, and I cannot wait to see Deeper if and when I get a chance to watch it. So, really, thank you so much for not only coming on the show, but creating an experience that I very much enjoyed, despite how emotional I did get at times watching it.
Thank you so much, Noah. I really appreciate you watching the movie. I appreciate you having me on and the really excellent questions you asked. And yeah, thank you very much to your viewers and listeners for watching. I really appreciate it.
No problem at all. Take care.